The Assembly will hear an address by His Excellency Xavier Bettel, Prime Minister, Minister of State, Minister of Communications and Media, and Minister for Religious Affairs of the Grand Duchy of Luxembourg. May I request protocol to escort His Excellency. I have great pleasure in welcoming His Excellency Xavier Bettel, Prime Minister, Minister of State, Minister of Communications and Media, and Minister for Religious Affairs of the Grand Duchy of Luxembourg, and invite him to address the General Assembly.
Merci, Madame.
Thank you very much, Madam Vice President. I'd like to begin on a personal note, if I may, and to thank the previous speaker, Mr. Charles Michel, who will be stepping down from his functions in the Belgian government, because in a few months he will be taking over the reins of the presidency of the European Council. And so I wanted to take this opportunity to publicly wish him well in that task as a dear neighbour for us as he steps into that role and will occupy it over the coming years. President, as I think we're all very well aware, the week that's currently underway here in New York is remarkable in a host of ways. Remarkable because of the level of representation of member states, which increases every year, but also remarkable because of the sheer number of topics and issues that we address during this week, whether that be here in the plenary session, or whether that take place in the major meetings, or in the smaller meetings that take place on the fringe of this plenary, with a raft of summits and high-level events. But this week is also remarkable thanks to the degree of unprecedented mobilization and determination to overcome very specific challenges. I will begin with the first of those challenges, a challenge which is evident and leaving its ravages in many countries, regions, towns, cities and villages around the world, and that is the climate emergency. The mobilization of our young people, the multiplication of the number of initiatives put forward by civil society, the private sector and international bodies is quite mind-blowing. It's remarkable, and we have seen full evidence of that over the last few days. That said, it is the action of states and of the men and women who govern these states from which must come the impetus and the determination to avoid an environmental, economic, and when all is said and done, geopolitical catastrophe. Whether it be international security, growth, migration, human rights, there is not a single field or aspect of the human experience which is today unaffected by climate change which becomes ever more alarming year on year. The recent report of the Intergovernmental Panel of Experts on Climate Change duly illustrated the sheer magnitude of the challenge and threw down the gauntlet on the need to act. Only by reducing by half current levels of greenhouse gas emissions between now and 2030, while simultaneously pursuing full climate neutrality by 2050, will be able to limit the global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees C. And I used the opportunity of the Climate Action Summit, and I'm grateful that we had that opportunity to be heard, to share with you the national contribution being made by Luxembourg in that common endeavour of curbing global temperature rises, to which a reduction by 50 to 55% of greenhouse gas emissions by 2030 when measured against 2005, an increase in the share of renewable energies to be used in our energy mix of 23 to 25% by 2030. We also intend to see a 40 to 44% increase in energy efficiency by 2030, and we will shortly adopt a framework law on climate aimed at ensuring Luxembourg is climate neutral by 2050 at the very latest. These figures are interesting, but they mustn't remain mere intellectual footnotes or abstracts, because on the basis of those figures, on the basis of those actions, it's up to us to reassure our children and the coming generations that the future they have is a bright one. The hope and optimism of emerging generations is fed and fueled and nurtured by the trust that they have in the actions of their parents, which are supposed to inspire them. However, in the fight against climate change over the coming decades, the young people are to be seen as our ally, because young people are inherently never opposed to change. Young people are rather harbingers of change. For young people, change is a virtue. It's a good thing, fundamentally. It is how things go. It is simply how life is as far as they're concerned. Because we are aware that life is synonymous with mobility, when one is young, and even more so when one has left youth behind, we have decided in Luxembourg to illustrate that the fight against climate change can indeed bring about positive change and an improvement in the quality of life and the living standards of all of us. And we have done so by introducing an unprecedented flagship measure, which is to make all public transport across the nation free of charge, whether it be buses, trams and trains, as of next year. We need, of course, a feasible public transport system. We can't allow our public transport system to buckle under this initiative. We're well aware of that, and we're working hard to make sure that that doesn't happen, to put all of the necessary steps in place to ensure that this flagship measure is a success and encourages a greener way of travelling. In terms of international solidarity when it comes to climate change, for the period 2021 to 2025, Luxembourg will allocate 200 million euros of financial and technical assistance to support activities linked to combating climate change in developing countries, with a priority for least developed countries and small island developing states. On an annual basis, in other words, we will be doubling our efforts when compared with the period 2014 to 2020. A significant share of these funds will go to the Green Climate Fund. Luxembourg will continue its own efforts to foster a pro-green financing culture. The Luxembourg Stock Exchange in 2016 launched the Luxembourg Green Exchange, the first such platform anywhere in the world for trading dedicated exclusively to green or environmentally friendly shares. In partnership with the European Investment Bank, which is headquartered in Luxembourg, we set up the Climate Finance Platform, which is intended to boost the leverage effect of private investments, channeling them towards investing in climate-related projects by creating a framework to mitigate the related financial risks. We hope to be able to extend this nascent initiative to the financing of sustainable development goals under the 2030 agenda. During the summit that met here yesterday, the day before yesterday, we were reminded of the huge sums necessary to realise our objectives. We're speaking here of trillions of euros. This is an effort that must be pursued through all development partners. The public purse alone will not be able to finance to the degree necessary. That said, the contribution of states remains nonetheless crucial, in particular when it comes to development financing. Another summit on this particular subject will take place in a chamber just a few steps from here soon. Luxembourg will share with you at that summit on climate financing, on development financing rather, some innovative initiatives, particularly in the field of vehicles for social and environmentally conscious investment. The mobilization of private resources is already a reality in Luxembourg. The most innovative mechanisms are not able to make up for any drop in public financing for tackling climate change. And so Luxembourg will continue to earmark 1% of its gross national income to official development assistance, with a particular focus on least developed countries and their needs. Sums allocated to international climate financing and to hosting climate refugees will also be boosted and targeted, with additional funds made available for them. Madam Vice President, the 5 summit meetings that took place this week on the fringes of the high-level debate of the General Assembly illustrate that the major challenges ranged against humanity cannot be overcome unless we act universally and as one, unless we find a global response. A lukewarm appreciation of multilateralism has opened the door to a weakening of multilateral fora and formats for the last decade or so, and this across the board in many fields, whether that be human rights, migration, security, as well as trade. To dwell on this latter example, resorting to unilateral measures and countermeasures, sometimes based on genuine concerns, but also often based on mendacious pretexts, has trapped us in a dangerous cycle where the entire international community and our people risk coming out the losers. It is our duty, it's a question of assuring our future, to regalvanize multilateral fora and formats. We have always been in favour of an active, dynamic and rules-based multilateralism as Luxembourg. That is perhaps natural for a very small country that has an open economy, but it's also a rational choice, setting aside considerations linked solely to sovereignty. To the extent that our resources permit, we work hard to participate in all those fora engaged in the pursuit of a more robust international cooperation. Thus, our participation in the High Ambition Coalition to tackle climate change, or indeed our contribution to the Alliance for Multilateralism, to give you but 2 examples of how we're active. In Europe, the European Union is the quintessential example of multilateralism through a process of integration and shared and pooled sovereignty. It has allowed our continent to enjoy relative peace. With this support, it should be said, of transatlantic institutions and has allowed us today to continue to build on the principles of enlightenment and to resist the populist trend and siren call by reaffirming the centrality of the rule of law in the European project. This is not without its tensions, but complacency is yet more dangerous still. Conflicts, frozen or not, disputes between states, internal tensions between ethnic and religious groups persist in Europe, particularly in Ukraine, the Caucasus and the Balkans. Europeans have no lessons to share. We cannot preach, but we are affected, and we saw that during the major migration crisis in 2015 by conflicts in our own backyard. President, the process of peace in the Middle East has eroded year on year. The perspectives for a fair and balanced peace, and thus a lasting peace, are declining in cadence with the falling degree of political determination to find a two-state solution. Recent developments in the context of the electoral campaign in Israel are proof of this. At the same time, the recent initiatives that are essentially bilateral in nature, even if they are to take material shape one day, cannot substitute for a multilateral approach which gives international legitimacy to any negotiated solution. The Near and Middle East are a source of great concern. The wars in Syria and Yemen are already nightmares for their civilian populations. The active involvement of regional powers in these conflicts, ever-shifting alliances, questions of faith and adherence to different religions or expressions of religion exacerbate tensions and augur ill for a return to stability in the near future. The suffering of the civilian population, the refusal of humanitarian assistance, ongoing and repeated and systematic violations of human rights in the region are our responsibility. There are real and tangible implications for the rest of the world, such as the recent events in Saudi Arabia and the oil stations there. In this region, we continue to pay collectively for the mistakes of the past. Let us not repeat the mistakes of the past. All actors in the region must contribute to calming the current tensions and avoiding escalation. This is also true of Iran, as well as of any other player in the region. Tehran must also resume full respect for all elements of the nuclear agreement of 2015. Luxembourg will, together with the entire European Union and the majority of the international community, do its best to uphold that agreement. We hope to believe that it is possible, even if it means expanding its scope, to make the 2015 agreement function. But for that to happen, the United States and Iran need to renew channels of communication. President, the very volatile situation in the Middle East and the Gulf recalls us of the contemporary crisis are complex and the potential for sparking conflagration enormous. No conflict today is limited to its immediate theatre. The mobility and the instantaneous character of communications have brought us closer together, and the suffering of peoples, even far-flung, is visible to each and every one of us. This is particularly true of Libya, where the situation is not improving at all. The Special Envoy, the Secretary-General, continues to tie himself in knots, trying to bring parties around the table. The suffering of the Syrian people have gone on for far too long. We call upon all parties to support the efforts of the Special Envoy. At a time when people smuggling is concentrated on the path between Saharan Africa and Europe through the Mediterranean, then we welcome the agreement to rescue and redistribute refugees fleeing through Libya to Europe. But we have to admit we cannot address the situation in Libya without addressing the plight of the thousands of African migrants and their process of transiting through war-torn nations in the hope to reach Europe. Our ties with the African continent are not just questions of migration. There has never been, nor will there ever be, this has never been the case, nor will it ever be. Our ties go back a long way, wrought as they are by geographic and cultural proximity and by common history, which is painful in parts and marked by the treatment of slaves and colonialism. But not just that. My country enjoys ties with peoples of the continent of Africa that have ties of friendship and solidarity. We have particularly close ties with French-speaking nations in Africa, and West Africa in particular. A significant part of our aid goes to them. In terms of conflict, resort to sexual violence as a weapon of war is a scourge which continues to bite all corners of the world. We've seen it in Equatorial Africa, in the region of the Great Lakes, but also in Iraq and the sinister aegis of Daesh, and in Europe and the Balkans. In March of this year, a conference in Luxembourg was convened under the auspices of the Grand Duke and Grand Duchess Foundation to give us an opportunity to hear poignant testimonies on this particular issue. It's allowed us to explore perspectives for reparation for the victims of these violence. It is vital for those who are responsible for the violations of human rights in situations of this ilk know that they will be held accountable for what they've done. This is true of victims of sexual violence and armed conflict, but also for the victims, for the child victims of armed conflict. Our organisation is not passive about their plight, but member states must recognise the necessary consequences of their actions, and initiatives aimed at reducing financing for the human rights protection or for the protection of children in armed conflict when it comes to making decisions on the financing of UN peacekeeping operations are difficult to justify. Our support for the International Criminal Court is non-negotiable, and this is vital when it comes to ensuring accountability. We hope that the ICJ will be much more active, not just in its prosecution policy, and for that reason we hail the action of the prosecutor of the court when it comes to addressing the plight of the Rohingya in Myanmar, but also in the issuing of its warrants and more effective in its organisation. The oppression of religious minorities, or the lack of their protection by the state, is something that we have not been able to eliminate in the 21st century. In Asia, Africa, the Middle and Near East, we have lost track of the situations where men and women are persecuted for their religious faith. Christians, Muslims, or those who practice another faith, there should be no distinction between their rights. And I know that the Europeans are in no position to lecture others on this issue. 75 years after the liberation of the extermination camps in Europe, the responsibility to remember of Europeans remains unchanged. We must continue to remember, particularly at a time when intolerance, hate speech, xenophobia, and even anti-Semitism is resurfacing in certain countries. My first visit to Auschwitz changed my life forever. Next January, I will hope to participate in the commemorations of the 75th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz by the Red Army. I don't know if any of you have ever been to Auschwitz, but I can promise you, you will not come away from such an encounter unmarked. In Auschwitz, you will see rooms full of human hair, full of spectacles, glasses, full of prosthetic limbs, full of suitcases, whole rooms full of these human articles and possessions. And each and everything that you will see is the memory of a life, somebody who lived and breathed and had a family. And those people were condemned to their awful and grim fate because they were Jewish. They didn't share the ideology of the Nazis because they were gypsies, because they were homosexuals, or simply because they were brave and courageous enough to resist. And so when, against that backdrop, I see that in certain countries you see a return of Nazi ideas and a denial of what happened, I really ask myself, did we really learn the lessons of the Second World War? I would also like to make it clear that we find it utterly unacceptable that increasingly state resources are used to silence those who have dedicated their lives to protecting human rights or to protecting the environment or to silencing the media. The work carried out in the Human Rights Council in Geneva on this issue is absolutely vital, and it makes a space for testimony as to what is actually going on. Unfortunately, human rights are not simply challenged or pushed back against simply when it comes to implementation. We have seen for the last few years a calling into question of the very existence of certain rights. That is particularly true and happens indeed within the very halls of this organisation when it comes to sexual and reproductive rights that affect very tangibly and concretely programmes aimed at providing reproductive health care for millions of women around the world. And this is a question of abortion and of the right of women to choose for themselves. If you go back a few decades in Luxembourg, the law simply provided for abortion for therapeutic reasons or when a woman's life or health was at risk. The law then changed and women were obliged to undergo an interview. But when I first became engaged in politics and took office, we quickly changed that law because we believe that for women, I personally believe that for women, an abortion is one of the most difficult and painful choices that she will make in her life. She needs a listening, sympathetic ear. She needs help. But it's not up to politicians to tell her what is good or not good for her at that critical juncture in her life. It's a decision for her to take and her to take alone. After mature reflection and with the necessary support that she may decide is necessary for herself. It is not up to the state to tell women what is best for them. Still less is it up to men to tell women what is best for them. This is a very difficult situation for women, and it is hard to believe that they are still subject to these pressures in 2019 and 2021, that the state or the opposite sex can tell women what is best for them. It's a decision for women alone. They have many decisions. Let us not render their lives more complicated than they need to be, particularly when it comes to such a painful and momentous decision. In 2020, President, we will mark the 25th anniversary of the Beijing Conference, which set up the Commission on the Status of Women, the CSW. I'm asking myself whether in today's world we'd be able to re-sign that convention setting up the Commission on the Status of Women in today's world, particularly when I listen to the words coming from some quarters when it comes to the rights of women. You can make the same charge about the rights of people to freely live out the expression of their sexual orientation. The day before yesterday here in New York, I headlined a debate on hate speech targeting LGBTI people. As I think we're all aware, we ought to be aware, homosexuality is not a choice. Let it be accepted that that is how people are. What is a choice is homophobia, and we should not tolerate it. This year, President, we will also mark the 30th anniversary of the Convention on the Rights of the Child, the CRC, which is an almost universal convention. I think it's important to renew our commitments thereunder, particularly in light of recent evolutions and changes that have occurred since its adoption, particularly in terms of the climate, the digital economy, etc. The human rights are part of our DNA in Luxembourg, whether that be at the national, European or international level. Human rights cover without discrimination the whole package of rights recognised by our organisation, including economic and social rights. It is against that backdrop that my country has put itself forward as a candidate to be elected to the Human Rights Council for the period 2022-2024. That would be the first time that we would take a seat since the Human Rights Council was set up if we're duly elected, and we hope to see large support from the General Assembly when the election comes due in 2021. I would be remiss of me, President, to miss this opportunity to recall just how important our organisation is. The fact that it exists is vital because it's the only organisation that can truthfully be said to represent the international community, and which to a certain extent is the international community itself. The reforms rolled out by the Secretary-General are making good progress. Now we need to shift them to the field, particularly in the areas of development and the reform of the security pillar of this organisation. The effort to adapt all the elements of the UN system is a sine qua non if we're to have a vibrant and dynamic multilateralism which the world is crying out for. This was, I've no doubt, what was in the minds of the signatories of the Charter of the United Nations, and we will have an opportunity next year to commemorate the 75th anniversary of the Charter. And we should reiterate our commitment to human rights. We're marking 75 years of the Charter, but next year we'll also mark 75 years of the liberation of my country. We are grateful to those who liberated us 75 years ago, including the American troops who gave their lives, 99.9% of whom are buried in my country, I'm sure, not even knowing where Luxembourg was, and yet they came to pay the price for our liberation. Americans and other allies as well. They came and they laid down their lives so that we might live freely and so that I might speak freely before you all. And the cemetery where those who fell on the field of honour in the Second World War liberating us is proof of the fact that while scars may heal, we must never forget. The summits and the debate that we've held this week have proven that the United Nations is crucial if we want to address the future in a clear-eyed way and overcome the challenges ranged against humanity. My country is ready to do so. The European Union is ready to do so. Together with our international partners, we want to ensure that we walk forward in lockstep because we know that the path ahead of us is long and sometimes difficult. So let's stop.
Speak about each other. Let's talk to each other. Thank you.
On behalf of the General Assembly, I wish to thank His Excellency Xavier Bettel, Prime Minister, Minister of State, Minister of Communication and Media, and Minister for Religious Affairs of the Grand Duchy of Luxembourg for the statement just made, and I request protocol to escort His Excellency.